Welcome to our first webinar on how to apply for a City of Los Angeles cannabis business license provided by the City of Los Angeles Department of Cannabis Regulation. I am Dr. Imani Brown, Social Equity Program Director for the department, and I will be your moderator this evening. The goal for tonight's webinar is to walk you through DCR's new pre-application and temporary approval processes, our workflows, and information procedure bulletins. Now, before we get started, let's take a moment to review some housekeeping rules. Please note that this webinar is being recorded and can be viewed after the editing process on DCR's website. You will be muted with cameras off for the duration of the webinar. This means that your camera and audio functions will not be available to you during this session. However, you will be able to see and hear all the panelists. There is an open chat box where you can interact with one another for networking or comment on the information. Please use caution when sharing personal information in a public forum and keep your questions focused on tonight's topic. Please ask questions about tonight's subject matter in the Q&A box. We will be gathering and responding to your questions throughout the presentation. We'll also have a robust Q&A session where you will get responses in the last 25 to 30 minutes of tonight's event. You are encouraged to utilize the Q&A box at the bottom pane of your Zoom screen. Chat is available for interaction with other participants. If you use the Q&A box for questions, everyone will be able to see the questions when they are answered. It is now my pleasure to introduce to you tonight's panelists, none other than Executive Director Kat Packer and Assistant Executive Director of Licensing, Compliance, and Administration, Jason Killeen. Without further ado, I'd like to pass on the virtual mic to you, Kat. Please feel free to address our audience and begin sharing your screen to showcase tonight's presentation.
Thank you so much, Dr. Brown. I'm excited to be here with everyone this afternoon to share information with stakeholders regarding how to apply for a cannabis business license here in the City of Los Angeles. Joining me in today's presentation is my Assistant Executive Director, Jason Killeen. He'll be helping me to get through these slides and to share information about our process. Next slide. So today's presentation is going to center around how our pre-application review process and our temporary approval process has changed, largely as a result of policy changes made by City Council that became effective in July of this year. Earlier this summer, DCR recommended a series of changes to the Los Angeles Municipal Code, specifically to streamline our application process and to reduce timelines associated with the application process. The recommendations made by DCR have been adopted by City Council, and our presentation tonight is going to highlight some of those policy changes, specifically changes to the Cannabis Procedures Ordinance and the Cannabis Location Restrictions Ordinance. Next slide. As I mentioned, City Council back in July of this year became effective policy changes made by City Council related to our licensing and land use restrictions. I do want to use this as an opportunity to both thank our stakeholders for continuously sharing feedback with us on how we can improve our pre-application process and temporary approval processes and our licensing process generally, and also thank City Council for working with the department to make amendments to our procedures to allow our pre-application process and temporary approval process to be more streamlined. Many of the changes and policies that we're going to talk about this afternoon again became effective in July of this year, but the Department of Cannabis Regulation has been working diligently to update all of our materials and public-facing information so that we can share these new updated streamlined processes with the public. Next slide. The next two slides will highlight a series of recent amendments to the municipal code. I won't sit here and read through all of them. Again, this presentation will be made available, but I will highlight a few of them. There have been changes to particular sections of the municipal code that relate specifically to the pre-application process and the temporary approval process. This particular slide highlights changes to the cannabis procedures ordinance. And we'll go ahead and go to the next slide, which highlights some of the changes to the cannabis location restrictions ordinance. Now, the changes to the cannabis location restrictions ordinance are going to be critically important for anyone who is interested in applying for pre-application review or temporary approval in the city of Los Angeles, because it has changed the way that we determine location eligibility and compliance. In our presentation, we'll detail this a little bit later. Next slide. Due to the comprehensive nature of the changes that were made to our municipal code, the department took our license or took certain functionality offline for our licensing portal over the summer and had announced that certain functionality, specifically the ability to submit new pre-applications, would be taken offline until October 1st. But over the last several months, the DCR licensing portal had been undergoing system updates to allow us to implement the procedural changes that were made to the municipal code. Next slide. We just recently announced on October 1st that we began to accept new applications for many new license types in the city of Los Angeles. And as of October 1st, individuals can apply for the following license types: delivery, micro business that includes delivery, distribution, distribution transport only, manufacturing type 6, manufacturing the N license, manufacturing with a P license designation, manufacturing for the S license, the cultivation processor license, the nursery license, and testing license. All of these license types are now available for members of the public to apply for. Please note that delivery and nursery licenses are limited to social equity applicants, specifically until January 1st of 2025. Next slide. The policy changes that were made by City Council necessitated changes to most of the Department of Cannabis Regulations forms, documents, bulletins, and other public resources that were maintained by the Department of Cannabis Regulation and were used by the Department of Cannabis Regulation stakeholders. So if you have old versions of some of our forms or documents, part of what we want to be able to share with you today is that there are now updated forms, updated resources, and we'll share throughout today's presentation what these resources are and how you can use them to help you navigate through the pre-application review process and the temporary approval process. Specifically, what I'd like to share with you all this afternoon are our newly updated pre-application review workflows and our newly updated pre-application review information and procedure bulletins. Of course, these specifically share information about the pre-application review process. And we'll also be sharing information about our newly updated temporary approval workflow and the newly updated temporary approval information and procedure bulletin detailing the temporary approval process. Next slide. So zooming out for a moment, I want to describe the application process generally for commercial cannabis licensing here in the city of Los Angeles. We have a pre-application review process, a temporary approval process, and then an annual licensing process. We're not going to spend too much time talking about the annual licensing process in today's presentation. We'll be focused on the pre-application review process and the temporary approval process. But stay tuned for more information from the Department of Cannabis Regulation about the annual licensing process, because that information will be forthcoming in the near future. Today, again, we're going to focus on pre-application review and temporary approval. And pre-application review is centered around location compliance and eligibility. Our temporary approval process is our application for a temporary license. In addition to submitting an application, in order to complete the temporary approval process, applicants will have to complete what we call an initial inspection. And if you are a social equity applicant, the temporary approval process also includes what the City of Los Angeles Department of Cannabis Regulation refers to as equity share review. And we'll get into the details of our equity share review process later, but equity share review is essentially the process that the Department of Cannabis Regulation uses to make sure that the social equity applicant owns the entity that is applying for a license. Next slide. We'll now share information specifically about pre-application review. It's important, if you're interested in applying for temporary approval, to first understand the pre-application review process, because the pre-application review process must be completed before an individual applies for temporary approval. Next slide. I want to take a moment to articulate that our pre-application review process has changed. Pre-application review process used to include a review of information about the business location and about the business owners. But as amended, our pre-application review process is exclusively now about determining business premises location compliance and eligibility before applying for temporary approval. All we're doing during the pre-application review stage is determining business premises location compliance and eligibility. There are several factors that DCR will consider when making its determination of whether or not a particular business premises location is eligible and compliant. We'll walk you through those factors, and we'll also walk you step by step through the pre-application review process. But in summary, what we're looking for when we're determining location compliance is the location eligible? Is there some reason why the location might not be eligible? Is the location appropriately distanced from what we define as a sensitive use? And we'll walk you through our definition of sensitive uses here in the city of Los Angeles. We're also looking to make sure that the zoning is appropriate for the underlying license activity. And for businesses specifically that are applying for licenses with on-site retail sales. So we're talking about storefront retail licenses. We're also making sure that the business premises location is appropriately distanced away from other on-site retail sales. Now, I will articulate that this last item that I mentioned isn't going to be directly applicable for folks who are applying for the license types that I had mentioned previously, the ones that became available on October 1st. We did not, we are not currently accepting new applications for storefront retail licenses. Next slide. Before I walk folks through the pre-application review process, I'd like to quickly review how the pre-application requirements have changed for those stakeholders who may have participated in our pre-application review process before. So originally, when individuals would go through the pre-application review process, we were not only looking at the proposed business premises address and the proposed commercial cannabis activity type, but we were also looking at information related to owners and what we define locally as primary personnel. You'll notice that some of the original requirements are highlighted in purple or have a purple text, and some are in red. What is in purple are the requirements that have moved from the pre-application review process to the temporary approval process. And the requirements that are listed in red are those that have been eliminated from our process entirely. Our new requirements are displayed on the right of the screen, and we'll go through these step by step. But essentially, the requirement is for individuals to apply for pre-application review, to pay the corresponding fees to identify the commercial cannabis activity type or license type that an individual may want to conduct at a particular location, and the identification of the proposed business premises address where that proposed activity would take place. We have added an attestation related to location eligibility. And again, we'll walk through these in further detail now. Next slide. So as I've mentioned, we've updated many of our materials related to our licensing process. And one of those materials and resources are our pre-application review workflow. The workflow itself describes the procedures both that the applicant would go through as they progress through the process, and also includes steps that the department would take as an applicant progresses through the process. Some of the new features that you'll notice on our pre-application review workflow include what we refer to as a DCR record status. You'll notice that this is the horizontal oval that runs along the center of the workflow. These are the statuses that an individual, an applicant, would be able to see in the DCR licensing portal as they progress through the process. You'll also notice an updated feature. We have included numbered steps as folks progress through the process. You'll see the red circles 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 on this pre-application review workflow. And these numbers that are on the pre-application review workflow really represent the step-by-step process that details the pre-application review process itself. The intention is to be able to review the pre-application review workflow in conjunction with the pre-application review information and procedure bulletin. If you have an opportunity to look at the pre-application review information and procedure bulletin, you'll notice that the numbers match up with the step-by-step process that's reflected in the workflow. And we'll walk through these different steps, step by step, but first wanted to show folks big picture how the pre-application review workflow has been amended and how folks should be able to utilize the pre-application review workflow in conjunction with the pre-application review information and procedure bulletin. Again, we'll zoom in for a moment and walk step by step through each process, but notice that the numbers will correspond with the following steps that we'll describe. Next slide. So again, the amended municipal code requires that an applicant undergo a pre-application review process prior to filing a temporary approval application to engage in commercial cannabis activity. And the purpose of this review is so that the Department of Cannabis Regulation can determine location compliance and eligibility. Specifically, we are determining whether the business premises location is eligible under Municipal Code Section 104.03A3 and compliant under LAMC 105. Next slide. Step number 1 in the pre-application review process requires an applicant to submit information required for pre-application review via the DCR licensing portal. Specifically, within the DCR licensing portal, an individual should submit all pre-application review information, including the proposed commercial cannabis activity types, the proposed business premises address, and a completed landowner attestation location eligibility form. The submission of this pre-application review information will create a pre-application review record in the DCR licensing portal. Please note that an incomplete or improperly filed pre-application review record shall be deemed abandoned by the applicant. Next slide. So the first step is to submit the required information. Detail what that information is. Again, it's essentially 3 things that we need at the pre-application review stage. What particular commercial cannabis activity type or license type would you like to apply for at this proposed location? And you can select from any of the activities that were mentioned previously. So an applicant could select that they were interested in delivery or distribution or the nursery license. After selecting and identifying the commercial cannabis activity type, an applicant would need to identify the proposed business premises address, where that particular activity would take place. And then part of what is required is a landowner attestation or a location eligibility form, which essentially describes that the location is not ineligible for a particular reason. And we'll walk through in detail why a particular location could be determined to be ineligible. The big picture, there are 3 things: the type of activity, the address, and this location eligibility form. After an applicant submits this information through the DCR licensing portal, DCR will automatically and immediately issue an invoice for pre-application review. This is the second step of the process. The third step and requirement is for an applicant to pay the pre-application review fee within 30 days. The pre-application review fee is $597. This fee must be paid within 30 days of the date the invoice was issued. Please note that failure to timely submit payment shall result in the abandonment of the pre-application review record. DCR does not have discretion to waive or amend this deadline. The deadline for invoices to be paid within 30 days is required by statute. Please note that the invoice itself will be located in the document section of the record. Payments must be submitted to the Office of Finance. You are able to and required to download and print the invoice and submit that invoice to the Office of Finance with payment. Our information and procedure bulletin regarding the pre-application review process details additional information regarding how the Office of Finance collects payments, including their hours, location, and payment methods. You can also visit the Office of Finance website for this information. Please note that if an individual is going through this process and seeking pre-application review, and they do not have an existing business tax registration certificate, often referred to as a BTRC, then the Office of Finance will require that a completed business tax application be submitted with payment. Next slide. So after the applicant submits their information, after we invoice the applicant, and after the applicant pays that invoice, DCR will review the proposed business premises location for compliance and eligibility. If the proposed business premises location is not compliant or eligible, DCR will notify the applicant via email. Please note that if any of the proposed commercial cannabis activities or license types that are selected do not comply with the zoning or distancing restrictions, the entire pre-application review will be deemed ineligible. But note that an applicant may submit a new pre-application review for another location or a new pre-application review at the same location, just removing whatever those particular non-compliant or ineligible activities were, subject to the payment of new pre-application review fees. Next slide. So when we're doing our review to determine, again, if a particular location is going to be compliant and eligible, we are reviewing 4 major land use considerations. Primarily, eligibility requirements under LAMC section 104.03A3, distancing from sensitive uses under LAMC section 105, distancing from other commercial cannabis businesses with on-site retail sales, and then zoning restrictions. We'll detail these in subsequent slides. So first, I'm going to walk through location eligibility requirements, specifically articulating the reasons why a particular business premises location may be considered ineligible. So a business premises would be considered ineligible if any of the following are true. If the business premises was the site of any illegal commercial cannabis activity after April 1st, 2018, as evidenced by a conviction for a period of 5 years from the date of conviction. Next, the business premises may be deemed ineligible if the business premises was the site of a disconnection of utilities under section 104.15E of our municipal code for a period of 5 years from the date of the disconnection. A business premises would also be considered ineligible if it was the site of padlocking under section 104.15.1 for a period of 5 years from the date of padlocking. A particular business premises would also be considered ineligible if the business premises is owned or managed by a person who holds office in any agency of the state of California and any of its political subdivisions, including the city and any of its agencies, departments, commissions, or boards of the state of California or its political subdivisions, when the individual's duties include the enforcement or regulation of commercial cannabis activity, or any other penal provisions of law of the state of California prohibiting or regulating commercial cannabis activity. A business premises would also be considered ineligible if the business premises was the site of illegal volatile cannabis manufacturing under Health and Safety Code Section 11379.6, as evidenced by a conviction for a period of 5 years from the date of conviction. After reviewing a business premises location for an eligibility, we're also looking to make sure that the activity is appropriately distanced from sensitive uses. I want to first spend some time explaining how the City of Los Angeles now defines what a sensitive use is. And this is critically important because this has changed significantly based on the updates to the municipal code that became effective on July 1st. As amended, local law requires the Department of Cannabis Regulation to utilize publicly available data, which is maintained both by state and local agencies, to determine the existence of sensitive uses as defined in our municipal code. Specifically, the databases and government agencies that will be defining what a sensitive use are: the California Department of Healthcare Services website for alcoholism or drug abuse recovery or treatment facilities, the California Department of Social Services website to identify daycare centers, the City of Los Angeles Public Library website to define public libraries, the City of Los Angeles Department of Recreation and Parks website for public parks, aquatic centers, and recreation centers, the California Department of Education's websites to define schools, and the City of Los Angeles's open portal list titled HCID LA Affordable Housing Projects List 2003 to present, or as may be amended, to provide a list of potential permanent supportive housing locations in the Affordable and Accessible Housing Registry, which would identify on-site services associated with each location. It is based on those lists that the department will define, or that the city will define, what is considered a sensitive use. Effective July 1st, DCR is required to retrieve data from these publicly available sources on a quarterly basis. We are required by statute to retrieve data on February 1st, May 1st, August 1st, and November 1st. And this is going to be critically important for our stakeholders and individuals who are applying, because this will bring predictability to the location compliance process. Essentially, we're going to be pulling data 4 times a year, and the Department of Cannabis Regulation will utilize the data that is retrieved in the quarter immediately preceding the date of the applicant's payment of their pre-application review fee to determine whether or not a particular location is compliant. Now, for individuals who had applications pending before the department prior to July 1st, the municipal code had a specific carve out that allowed us to pull data on July 1st and utilize that data for the purposes of determining location compliance. Part of the reason why this change is going to be so impactful to our applicants and to our stakeholders is because previously the Department of Cannabis Regulation was required to essentially do multiple reviews for location compliance throughout the application process. And that data is changing all the time as new schools could open up, as new parks could be created, et cetera. And many stakeholders expressed to us frustration in that their data was constantly changing. The law has been amended such that the data that the Department of Cannabis Regulation is going to be using henceforth will only be changing on a quarterly basis. So we are no longer doing a day of assessment of whether or not a particular location is appropriately distanced from sensitive uses, or doing a review of sensitive uses every day to determine whether or not a particular location or a group of applicants are compliant. Again, we will be pulling this data on a quarterly basis, and we will be utilizing the data that is retrieved in the quarter immediately preceding the date of the applicant's payment. So applicants will know what list, what data is being used to determine whether or not a particular sensitive use exists. And then the next quarter, there will be a new set of data that is pulled and utilized, and we will post the data as we pull it from these, as we compile the data from these publicly available sources. We will also be publishing this data on our website so that members of the public have access to the same information that the Department of Cannabis Regulation is using to determine if a sensitive use exists. Next slide. Now, for the activity types that I had described previously, those that individuals can apply for today, we are primarily looking to make sure that the location that is proposed is at least 600 feet away from schools, as defined on our publicly available data. That's the main distancing requirement that those particular activities that are going to be applicable to those particular activities. However, we'll cover other distancing requirements as they exist. Specifically, businesses with on-site retail sales are required to be 700 feet away from schools, public parks, public libraries, alcoholism or drug abuse recovery or treatment facilities, daycare centers, and permanent supportive housing, and any other licensed retail business with on-site sales. And a volatile manufacturing business is required to not only be 600 feet away from a school, but also 200 feet away from residentially zoned property. But again, if you are seeking to apply for one of the specific activities that was listed at the beginning of the presentation, namely testing, the nursery license, the cultivation processor license, the manufacturing SPN type 6 distribution or delivery, you are only required to be 600 feet away from a school, as defined, as amended and defined in the municipal code. Next slide. We just talked about distancing, that requirements that exist for businesses with on-site retail sales. But again, these businesses are required to be 700 feet away from other retail businesses. Please note that this does not apply for to delivery only licenses, whether that be delivery as a part of a micro business or delivery as a standalone license. This particular policy does not apply to delivery businesses. Delivery businesses can be right next to one another, but if you are engaged in storefront retail sales, those activities have to be located 700 feet away from each other. Next slide. During our review of location, eligibility, and compliance, we're also making sure that the proposed activity is appropriately zoned for that particular business premises address. What we've done is we have included in our pre-application review information and procedure bulletin a summary of the general zoning restrictions for individual commercial cannabis activity types. I would encourage everyone to take a look at that chart to understand and see a summary of those zoning restrictions. But if you're looking for the specific zoning restrictions for specific plan areas, you can refer to LAMC section 105.02. If after looking at those 4 land use considerations that we just reviewed in step 4, at step 5, we will have reviewed that information and will communicate to the applicant whether or not that particular pre-application review is eligible for further processing. If we determine that the business premise location is both compliant and eligible based on the requirements, the pre-application review record status will be updated in the licensing portal to eligible for processing, and the applicant will receive a notification of this status via email. Once a pre-application review record status is eligible for processing, the applicant has completed the pre-application review process and may submit a temporary approval application. So individuals who are going through the pre-application review process, ultimately, you want to be able to get to this status of eligible for further processing. And that is what is going to allow you to essentially unlock the ability to apply for temporary approval. Next slide. This particular slide just includes a screenshot of both the pre-application review information and procedure bulletin on the left and the pre-application review workflow on the right. As I had mentioned at the top of this presentation, you'll notice that the numbers on the pre-application review procedure correspond with the numbers on the pre-application review workflow. So if you're looking at the workflow and want more detailed information about the process, all you need to do is to look at the pre-application review information and procedure bulletin and find the corresponding step. Next slide. So we've walked through our new and updated pre-application review requirements process. And now I just want to share quickly information about our anticipated timelines. And if you wouldn't mind, Jason, going back to the previous slide, I'll make a point about the anticipated timelines. So I'll first note by articulating that because our process has been amended, we're now in the position for the first time to be able to anticipate specific timelines, processing timelines associated with the pre-application review process. And what we anticipate is that from the moment an applicant gets the record status, and again, that's that horizontal oval of pre-application received, we should be able to process the pre-application review to the next status of either eligible for further processing, or if that particular location is not eligible, to receive the notification of ineligibility within 30 days. So we anticipate that the pre-application review process, our actual review of the information, should take no more than 30 days. Again, that assumes that we have all of the information that's required. It assumes that the applicant has paid their fee within 30 days. But again, from the record status of pre-application received to eligible for processing, DCR anticipates that on average, applicants should be able to complete this process in no more than 30 days. Next slide. And we can go to the next slide. We are now moving into the temporary approval process. We will assume that the applicants have completed the pre-application review process and have reached the status of eligible for further processing. You've completed the pre-application review process. You've identified that the activity type that you want to conduct and the address that you want to use to conduct that activity is compliant. You have your status eligible for further processing. You are now able to apply for temporary approval. The rest of this presentation is going to focus on walking you through specifically the temporary approval process. Next slide. Again, just like our pre-application review resources have been updated, the Department of Cannabis Regulation has updated its resources related to the temporary approval process. Specifically, we have a newly updated temporary approval workflow and a newly updated temporary approval information and procedure bulletin. We have screenshots of both of these documents here. Next slide. And similarly, you'll notice these workflows both have the updated record status. This is a new feature of this workflow. And you also have corresponding numbers associated with each step. Those are represented in the red or maybe pink bubbles that you see throughout the process. And the numbers on the workflow, again, correspond with the step-by-step processes and procedures that you will find in the corresponding information and procedure bulletin. We'll walk through these steps one by one. Now, next slide. So just as background, our temporary approval is defined as a temporary license that allows an applicant to engage in commercial cannabis activity for a limited time under the same privileges as a non-temporary license of the same type. Temporary approval is a license from the Department of Cannabis Regulation, but it does not waive or otherwise circumvent any other city or state requirements or necessary permits from the city, state, or other public agencies, including but not limited to a certificate of occupancy permit or other authorization from the state. Please note that DCR may immediately suspend a temporary approval if the applicant is conducting commercial cannabis activity without all necessary permits, inspections, or similar clearances to operate from another city, state, or other public agency, or if the applicant is conducting commercial cannabis activity without an active state license for that commercial cannabis activity. Next slide. Again, please note that before applying for temporary approval, an applicant must undergo the pre-application review process and receive the status of eligible for further processing. Once a pre-application record status is updated to eligible for processing, the applicant has completed the pre-application review process and may submit a temporary approval application. Next slide. Please note that the process has been amended to try and allow for there to be an efficient and streamlined transition from pre-application review to temporary approval. So you'll notice that the step eligible for further processing is really the last step that you need to complete in the pre-application review workflow, but it's the first step that's listed in the temporary approval workflow. So these should really work in tandem, side by side. Please review both workflows and information and procedure bulletins accordingly. Next slide. So we'll now detail the requirements to receive temporary approval. And the first of which is that an applicant must submit all required temporary approval application information, which includes forms and documents, to DCR through the licensing portal within 1 calendar year of the date their pre-application review record status is updated to eligible for further processing. If all required temporary approval application information is not submitted within 1 calendar year of receiving the record status of eligible for processing, the pre-application review record may be abandoned. The temporary approval information and procedure bulletin details the required information, documents, and forms for the pre-application review process. We'll summarize them now. Next slide. On your screen, you will see the required temporary approval application forms. You can find these forms on our website at cannabis.lacity.org under the application forms and documents section. Next slide. In addition to the forms, there are specific documents that are required. The procedure bulletin, the information and procedure bulletin details what these documents are, but here's a quick summary. Next slide. We included screen grabs of the screenshots of the temporary approval application procedure bulletin and the temporary approval workflow. Again, please notice that the numbers that correspond with the temporary approval workflow are directly aligned with the step-by-step process and the temporary approval procedure. So you'll notice that on the left side, the first step is for the applicants to submit the information required for the temporary approval application via the DCR licensing portal. That's the same step that you'll see on the workflow. So please utilize these documents together as resources to help navigate through the process. Next slide. We'll now walk you step by step through the temporary approval process. Again, the first step is for the applicant to submit the information that's required for temporary approval via the DCR licensing portal. Again, applicants must submit all required information within 1 calendar year of the date the pre-application review record is updated to a status of eligible for processing. Next slide. Second, after an applicant submits a temporary approval application through the DCR licensing portal, related invoices will be generated and available in the DCR licensing portal. Applicants will also be invoiced for a Los Angeles Fire Department inspection fee at this time. Next slide. Again, the third step is for applicants to pay their fees within 30 days. It's critically important for applicants to pay their corresponding fees within 30 days. Again, the department does not have discretion to allow applicants extensions. The deadline or requirement to pay fees within 30 days of the invoice is required by local law. The application itself won't be considered filed until after the submission of all required fees and information, including forms and documents. When the department determines that an applicant has submitted the required information and paid the corresponding fees, the record status will be updated to application received. Next slide. After the information has been submitted, we've invoiced the applicant and the applicant has paid the invoice. The department will review the application to make sure that the application is complete. DCR will review the application for completeness and communicate any deficiencies to the applicant if within 1 calendar year of receiving a status of eligible for processing, the applicant submits the required information and documents to the department. If the information is not complete, the applicant shall be provided 30 days to submit corrected information to the department. Applicants who submit temporary approval application information to the department early may have multiple opportunities to submit corrected information. As such, we do encourage applicants to submit a complete temporary approval application as soon as possible. That way you have essentially the duration of that 1 calendar year as an opportunity to submit corrected information if necessary. Once the department determines that an applicant has submitted all of the required information, forms, and documents, and we just went through what those required information, forms, and documents are, the record status of that particular application will be updated to local compliance underway. It is not until the department determines that an applicant has submitted all of the required information that the record status will be updated to local compliance underway. Next slide. After your record status is updated to local compliance underway, DCR will send an email notifying the applicant of this record status update. And it is at this time that if the California Department of Cannabis Control, or DCC, requests DCR to verify a status of an applicant, that DCR would confirm to the Department of Cannabis Control that the applicant's status is local compliance underway. Now, if an applicant had applied for a state license before reaching the status, and we were still within the 90-day period that we could respond to the state, we would follow up then and respond to the state that local compliance is underway. But applicants will not only get the status update in the licensing portal, but DCR will also email the applicant to notify them of this updated record status. Applicants will also receive another email that will detail and share information, letting the applicant know that the application is complete, and it'll also include information regarding next steps. Namely, for all applicants, part of these next steps are going to be completion of an initial inspection. The email is also going to make reference and articulate that for applicants who are social equity applicants, those next steps would also include equity share review. And it's at this point, after the record status is updated to local compliance underway, that if the applicant is a social equity applicant, that the application would enter the queue for equity share review. The email will also include information detailing the equity share review process. And I'll share some information about the equity share review process in just a few moments. Next slide. So after DCR sends an email to the applicant notifying the applicant of their next steps, which could include an initial inspection, we will allow the applicant to request an initial inspection. But before an applicant requests an initial inspection, we encourage applicants to prepare for the initial inspection. The initial inspection itself is a required inspection of the business premises conducted by DCR prior to the issuance of temporary approval. First, applicants should review and complete the initial inspection attestation form. And this form is used to confirm that the business premises is ready for inspection. We also ask that any pre-existing deficiencies be corrected before DCR conducts its initial inspection of the business premises. Next slide. Again, first, folks should get an email from DCR letting them know that they are eligible to request an inspection. Please do not contact the department to request an initial inspection until you are eligible. and it is confirmed by the department that you are eligible to request an initial inspection. But once you would receive that notification, applicants may request an initial inspection by emailing dcrlicensing@lacity.org with the subject line request for initial inspection. Please also include your application number. In the email that you send to DCR, we ask that you provide at least 3 preferred dates and times, that would happen at least 3 business days after the email is sent. Proposed dates and times within 3 business days of the request may be accommodated subject to the payment of applicable expedited services fee. Again, we want applicants to provide that initial inspection attestation form and attach that initial inspection attestation form to the email with the subject line request for initial inspection. So we want you to attest that you're ready for the inspection, attach that signed attestation to your email requesting the inspection. DCR will then respond to the email to confirm the date and time for the initial inspection based on the preferred times that were proposed by the applicant. And then the applicant should confirm that the time selected by the department still works for them. Requests to reschedule or cancel an initial inspection must be emailed at least 48 hours in advance to dcrlicensing@lacity.org with the subject line reschedule initial inspection request. Again, please include your application number. Unless rescheduled or canceled at least 48 hours in advance, failure to appear for an initial inspection will result in a failed inspection. Applicants who receive a failed inspection status must schedule another inspection and must pay a separate inspection fee. Next slide. We've just walked through the process of scheduling the inspection. We'll now quickly detail what happens on the day of the initial inspection. First, I'll articulate that currently DCR is conducting initial inspections virtually. The email that we send to applicants letting them know that they are eligible to request an initial inspection will include detailed information about the technology requirements that are necessary to conduct a virtual inspection. We also have technical support if folks need help to make sure that they can meet those technology requirements. But on the date of, DCR will give a brief introduction and provide information on how the initial inspection will be conducted. Essentially, we're using the same checklist that is included on the initial inspection attestation form to determine that the business premises location and the corresponding activities are compliant with information in that initial attestation form. At the conclusion of the initial inspection, DCR will conduct a brief debrief with the applicant discussing the initial inspection results and any next steps. The initial inspection itself will result either in a pass or fail designation. If passed, the applicant will continue with the temporary approval application process. If failed, as mentioned previously, an applicant may request an additional initial inspection. Next slide. If you are a non-social equity applicant, that would be the last step in the temporary approval process. If you are a social equity applicant, there is an additional step involved in temporary approval. We refer to this process as equity share review. Specifically, if you are a participant in the social equity program, you are required to provide information to DCR to demonstrate compliance with our social equity program. The requirements of the social equity program itself can be found in LAMC section 104.20. During the equity share review, DCR is looking at all previously submitted temporary approval application information, including documents and forms and equity share documents, to determine if the application complies with the social equity program and related equity share requirements. For more information regarding the social equity program and related equity share requirements, please review the Social Equity Program Entity Eligibility Verification Information and Procedure Bulletin. The department has put together a standalone information and procedure bulletin to assist applicants in understanding what the social equity program's equity share requirements are and how we use the equity share review process to make sure that not only the social equity individual applicant complies with the program, but that the entity that is applying for a license also complies with the program. Essentially, we want to make sure that the social equity applicant that is been verified under our program has the appropriate ownership rights in the company that's going to be potentially issued a license. So social equity applicants who are looking for more information about that process, please review our social equity program Entity Eligibility Verification Information and Procedure Bulletin. This resource is linked in our temporary approval information and procedure bulletin and can also be found online on the social equity program page. Next slide. Specifically, what we're looking for when we're doing our equity share review is to make sure that the application complies with the requirements. The requirements themselves detail specifics about the unconditional ownership of equity share. We're also looking at the profits, dividends, distributions of the entity. We want to make sure that the equity applicant has the requisite voting rights and control. There are also specific provisions related to successors. Again, please review the information and procedure bulletin in detail. We'll also make sure that subsequent webinars and resources zoom in on these requirements and provide additional resources on how to navigate through the equity share review process. Next slide. Again, the purpose of equity share review is to make sure that the application is compliant with the social equity program's requirements. When we're reviewing all of the information in that application, if we identify possible violations, it may be necessary for the applicant to submit additional information or documentation. If necessary, DCR will respond to the applicant with an equity share correction sheet, which will document any deficiencies or document the need for additional information to clarify whether or not a particular provision or something in the application is compliant. Applicants who receive an equity share correction sheet should review the information provided by DCR, make the necessary amendments or clarifications, and submit updated forms or documents to the record within the licensing portal. Essentially, we're using the correction sheet to identify violations. If we identify violations or potential violations, those violations or potential violations will be documented on the equity share review correction sheet. Applicants will have an opportunity to review them, to update information to us, and we would review that information that was submitted back to us in its entirety, again, to determine if there are violations. So it could be the case that there are multiple rounds of equity share review because every time we get updated information, we're going to look at the entire package of the application to make sure that the application in its entirety is compliant with requirements. Again, we're using that equity share correction sheet to document any potential violations, or it may not even necessarily be that there's a violation. It may be the case that the department needs additional information to clarify that there's not a violation, but we're using the equity share correction sheet as our means to document that. And then we will be affording applicants an opportunity to make corrections and provide those corrections back to the department for review. Next slide. After, and then again, this step 7 is only applicable to social equity applicants, but after these steps are completed, an applicant would have completed all of the requirements for temporary approval. And at that point, the department would update the record status to temporarily approved, and the applicant would receive notification of temporary approval via email. Next slide. Oh, this slide simply shows what the equity share correction sheet looks like. Next slide. So again, part of what and this particular process is going to wrap up the temporary approval process. We want to just quickly articulate that the amendments that were made to the municipal code have amended other processes. Today's presentation is focused on pre-application review and the temporary approval application. Future webinars will detail some of those other changes, specifically changes to the public convenience or necessity process or the PCN process. We will continue to update all of our public-facing information and resources as new information is available. Let's go ahead and go to the next slide. So we walked through the temporary approval requirements and process. I do want to make a quick note about our anticipated timelines. Jason, if you can take me back to a slide that shows the workflow, I would appreciate it. Thank you so much. I can work with that. So as in terms of our the anticipated timelines associated with the temporary approval process, again, the department is not going to consider an application to be filed until after the information is submitted in the portal and a fee is paid. So it's essentially after step 3 when we get to the status of application received. With record status is where the cursor is currently hovering. We anticipate that between the record status of application received, well, from the status of application received, we should be able to determine whether or not an application is complete in no more than 60 days. And so applicants should be able to get from application received to the status of local compliance underway if it is actually complete within a period of 60 days. From the time that the record status is updated to local compliance underway, the timing of the initial inspection is really going to be driven by the applicant. Again, we let the applicant know at that point in time that they're eligible to request an inspection, but we are not requiring the applicant to complete an inspection within a specified period of time. We anticipate that we can get through our initial inspections rather quickly, and so we anticipate that within 45 days of the request, the initial inspection should be completed, should be scheduled much more expeditiously. Similarly, from that status of local compliance underway to when someone may complete their equity share review, we are looking at dozens of documents, sometimes hundreds of pages of different documents, but are anticipating that the process to review those documents shouldn't take more than 45 days and could be much quicker depending on how many other applicants are in the queue for that review process. What that means in general is that we anticipate that applicants, that the process, our review process itself should on average take 90 days. for temporary approval, from the record status of application received to temporary approval. On average, we anticipate that process to take 90 days. And again, I want to thank the City Council for working with us so that we could amend the process so that for the first time, we can have kind of predictability of our temporary approval process. Part of the reason why we're able to do this for the first time is that our updated temporary approval process no longer includes the requirement for applicants to get a state license before they get temporary approval. It no longer requires that they complete a fire inspection or get a certificate of occupancy before temporary approval. We previously had a temporary approval process that included a bunch of other agencies' processes within our process, and that was the main reason why it was impossible for us to articulate how long a particular process would take. However, because we have removed other agencies' processes from our temporary approval process, we're now in a position where we will have a much more streamlined process and can communicate with transparency about our anticipated timelines. That being said, I do want to articulate again that although our temporary approval process is now a standalone process, our process and our license does not waive any other agencies' permits, licenses, or requirements, and applicants are expected to be compliant with all city and state county laws. And we do have the authority now, if we learn that applicants are conducting temporary approval without the necessary permits, to revoke that authorization. Jason, if you could kind of close me out on the second to last slide, I'd appreciate it. The last thing that I want to articulate for folks this afternoon is that we have another workshop or webinar coming up on the 26th, which will be from 6 to 7:30 p.m. We are going to listen to feedback and information that we receive based on the questions that we receive in tonight's presentation. And we will use our feedback to make some further tweaks and changes to the updated presentation. And so if you watch this presentation, joining us live, and you still have additional questions, I encourage you to join our next webinar on October 26th and continue to participate in programming made available through the Business Licensing and Compliance Assistance Program, as these resources have been developed specifically for social equity applicants, but are available to all members of the public to serve as resources to help navigate through the process. I'll now turn things back over to Dr. Amani Brown.
Thank you, Kat and Jason. Now we're going to open up the session for Q&A. We are going to extend the session out for a few minutes as we're running a little behind, but that was so much important information. We think that it's important to extend it out. So we're going to try to answer as many questions live as possible. Any questions that are not answered this evening will be answered in writing and can be assessed via our DCR's website. So with Kat, are you and Jason ready to tackle some of these questions?
Yes.
Okay.
Let's started. Thank you.
Okay, let's get right into it. So first up, Sanaa asked, if you are applying as a social equity entity, does that entity's name need to be on the lease for the property? What if the name on the lease is the social equity applicant name, or can it be a third party?
I'm going to pass that question to Jason. Thank you.
The social equity applicant's name does not have to be listed on the lease. However, all of the landowner attestations, which confirm that the landowner has granted the business the opportunity to operate at the location, do have to be in the business's name.
Okay, thank you, Jason. This is from Anthony. Can you have all the same manufacturing types under one location?
I'll take this question, Dr. Brown. So Each specific activity is going to, there aren't any distancing requirements for these particular activities. You will need a license for the underlying business premises location where the activity is taking place. Jason, if you want to expand on this response, feel free.
Sure. The type 6 activity covers the activities under the type P, the type N, and the type S. Before, DCR only offered the type 6 to give applicants the opportunity to engage in all of those activities. However, in order to comply with building code and fire code, some applicants had indicated that would be easier if they were only applying for one of those subcategories. So we made the subcategories available. So if you're interested in doing all of the activities, I would recommend applying for the type 6 license.
Okay, thank you. So Edwin's asking, what is the buffer zone needed now with the new amendments between two retail cannabis businesses for social equity?
So thank you for the question, Edwin. I want to note that there aren't any specific distinctions that are made between social equity applicants and non-social equity applicants for the purposes of distancing requirements. All retail businesses with on-site sales have to be 700 feet away from other on-site businesses, on-site retail businesses with on-site sales. However, delivery businesses don't have to be distanced away from one another. So there could be 20 delivery licensees right next to one another. But if there's a storefront retail facility, that business is going to need to be 700 feet away from any other storefront retail facility.
Okay, thank you, Kat. Laura asked, can you have a nursery delivery and delivery at the same spot?
So these can take place at both nursery and delivery can take place at the same location. Each activity type is going to need its separate business premises, even if it's just designated through different walls and structures, but these can take place on the same parcel. And I saw that there was another question about the timeline for approval for a nursery license. The timelines that we articulated today are for every single license type. And so again, we're anticipating a 30-day pre-application review process and on average a 90-day temporary approval process, regardless of license type.
Okay, thank you. Spencer wants to know what consists of a landowner attestation.
I can take this, Dr. Brown. So again, there are a couple of landowner attestations that are required. There's one that's required during the pre-application review stage currently. This particular attestation requires the landowner to attest that the location isn't eligible for reasons that were described, including that the location was the site of utility disconnect, if it was the site of padlocking, it's the site of illegal activity as evidenced by a conviction. So location eligibility is one of the landowner attestations that's required, and that's specifically required during the pre-application review process. And then there is a separate landowner attestation that is required at the temporary approval process that essentially is the landowner acknowledging that commercial cannabis activity is taking place at their particular premises. So two separate attestations, one required at pre-application review, another required at the temporary approval process.
Okay, Anna's question, what is the deadline to submit a pre-application?
So there is no specific deadline to submit a pre-application review. We will accept pre-application reviews on a rolling basis. Applicants can actually submit multiple pre-application reviews at the same time. So if you identified 3 different properties in the city that you were interested in potentially conducting commercial cannabis activity at, and you wanted to make sure that any or all 3 of those locations were compliant, You could submit those back to back, and we will review all three of those locations together, but there is no deadline to submit a pre-application review. The deadline that was mentioned previously comes after you have completed a pre-application review. After you complete the pre-application review and you get this record status of eligible for processing, that's when the deadline comes into play. We want to make sure that an applicant submits a complete temporary approval application within 1 year of receiving the status of eligible for further processing, which comes after you complete the pre-application review process.
Okay. This is a question from William. If the location is ineligible, do you have to start the licensing application process all over again?
So we've structured this process to try and reduce burdens for applicants. And so the pre-application review process is just about location compliance. So you would know before you even applied for a temporary approval or applied for a license whether or not the location is compliant. So it's not that you'd have to start the temporary approval process over. You wouldn't be allowed to start the temporary approval process if the location wasn't compliant. However, if we conduct the pre-application review and we learn that the location, and through our review process, we determine that the location isn't compliant, you will have to, if you're interested in identifying another property, you will have to complete another pre-application review for the new property that was identified.
Okay. This is from Edwin. Will the social equity applicant that was denied their license due to a buffer zone or sensitive use issue have a chance to find a new location and resubmit their application?
So again, you wouldn't be resubmitting an application because you wouldn't even have an opportunity to submit an application in the first place if your location wasn't compliant. We're intentionally taking care of location compliance before people invest money in property. You don't need to have a lease at the time you go through the pre-application review process. All the pre-application review process is a means to determine that your location is compliant. You haven't even applied for a license before during the pre-application review. That's why it's called pre-application review. We're conducting location compliance before you even apply for a license. So if it's not that your license would be denied, but if the location that you select is ineligible, then you would have to find another location, conduct pre-application review for that new location. If that new location was eligible, once you got that status of eligible for further processing, you would then be able to apply for temporary approval.
Okay, this is from Paul. Is there a way to find out if a location is eligible prior to applying?
That is the pre-application review process.
All righty. From Alvaro, he's applying for a distribution license. Can he sublet a location with a non-retail delivery service in a retail location?
I'm going to pass that question to Jason.
Okay.
Like everything land use related, the answer is it depends. If the location is properly zoned, you could sublet a portion of the business premises to another prospective applicant or licensee, provided that that applicant licensee has its own distinct business premises that they would utilize for their own application. If you've utilized the entire floor plan for your application, you would have to submit a business premises diagram to amend your business premises diagram and what you're authorized to use to basically remove whatever would be sublet to a third-party applicant. Because there were different rules in place for phase 1 and phase 2 applicants, the zoning that was authorized under the original location may not be compliant with the zoning that would be allowed for a general applicant. So those are things to keep in mind. I would refer you to the IPB and the applicable zoning for those particular activities.
Okay, thank you, Jason. This is from Pepe. He wants to know what distance does his business need to be away from a school, a library, or a park?
Thank you for your question. So first, I'd encourage you to look at the pre-application review information and procedure bulletin. The distance that you need to be away from a particular sensitive use is going to depend on the particular license type that you are applying for. But what's going to be, I'll say if you're applying for any of the activities that we discussed today, the ones that are available for folks to apply for today, the main sensitive use that you should be concerned about are schools. You will need to be 600 feet away from a school, regardless of the activity type. There aren't other sensitive uses for if you're engaging in delivery, distribution, testing, et cetera. You don't have to worry about any of the other sensitive uses. The sensitive use that's going to be directly applicable for the activities that we're talking about this afternoon are going to be schools. Again, 600 feet away from schools. If you're interested in applying for retail, then you would need to be not only 600 feet away from school, but 700 feet away from all of the other sensitive uses as defined. But for more detailed information, I'd look at the pre-application review information and procedure bulletin.
Okay, thank you. This was from Lynette. She says that many landlords are not leasing to dispensaries unless you're fully licensed. Is there a way that the applicant can obtain a letter of passing the pre-application in hopes that the landlord would be more cooperative to leasing a storefront?
You are more than welcome to take the pre-application review notification that says that you are eligible for processing to the property owner. The department is not going to produce any other standalone document for that purpose.
Okay, this one is from Eric. If I have a delivery license application in process, would I be able to apply for another license during this same time frame or round? And if there is a limit to how many applications we can apply for?
For the activities that we're accepting applications for today, yes, you can apply for another license. This is not considered a round. The process and application period is open. We will be accepting applications on a rolling basis. So you could have a delivery application that's pending. You can apply for every single license type that we listed today. That's not going to restrict that activity. There is not currently a limit on the number of applications an entity can apply for the specific activities that we discussed today.
This isn't quite temporary approval or pre-app related, Kat, but I'm going to ask the question anyway because it's something that folks ask all the time. This is from Pepe again. Do you have any recommendations for legal advice in the DCR office?
So for individuals who are interested in legal advice, I'd tell you two things. One, if you are a phase 3 retail round 1 applicant, if you are one of the 200 phase 3 retail round 1 applicants that was determined eligible for further processing through phase 3 retail round 1, you currently have access to participate in the pro bono legal services that are made available through the social equity program. You can go on the website at cannabis.lacity.org. Under the social equity page, there's a pro bono legal services tab. Only 2 steps we need you to complete in order to have access to pro bono legal services. We need you to complete a survey and authorize that we share the information. There are 2 documents. You can fill them out in less than 10 minutes online. As soon as you would fill that information out, we would refer you directly to the Los Angeles County Bar Association, who we are in partnership with, to provide pro bono legal services. Outside of the phase 3 retail round 1 applicants, we have yet to be able to make the pro bono legal services available to other applicants. But we are considering and looking for ways to expand the pro bono legal services that we have available to us. Please And you can utilize even the survey that's going to be made available at the end of this presentation to communicate to us that that's something that applicants need. I think part of what we want to be able to know is that it's a service that's in demand and that applicants are going to take advantage of.
Thank you, Kat, for that. This is from Alexis. How is the 600-foot zone for sensitive use defined? Is it from parcel to parcel or entrance to entrance?
I'm going to pass that question to Jason. Thank you.
So it's measured from the closest parcel boundary of the sensitive use to the closest exterior wall where the commercial cannabis activity would occur, as measured in a straight line. We can't go around buildings and stuff to kind of work our way into some other measurement. Straight line, closest parcel line of the sensitive use to the closest exterior wall of where the commercial cannabis activity would occur.
Thank you, Jason. This is from Sana. If we have further unanswered questions regarding the application process, is there an email number we can reach out to?
Absolutely. If you are an analyst or if you are an applicant that has already applied, every single applicant is assigned an analyst. I would encourage our existing applicants to reach out to their designated analyst. I'd also articulate that we are going to be working primarily with Dr. Brown and through the Business Licensing and Compliance Assistance Program to make additional resources and one-on-one support available to applicants in the coming months. In the interim, if you have questions, you can feel free to send them to the Social Equity Program team or to dcrlicensing@lacity.org.
Okay, thank you. This is from Eric. With these new changes, does that mean we don't have to lease a location until the temporary licensing process? Or would we just need the landlord's agreement regarding this location?
Thank you for the question, Eric. That's absolutely correct. With this new process, you do not need to have a lease until you are actually applying for temporary approval. You do not need to have a lease while you are completing the pre-application review process. We're just trying to make sure that the location is compliant. What we need from the from the property owner at the time of pre-application review is simply an attestation that acknowledges and that articulates that the location is not ineligible for the reasons that were previously described. But you do not need to have a lease until you have identified a property that is compliant and can move forward in the temporary approval process.
Okay, thank you. This next question is from Laura. Can I use the local compliance underway email to apply with the state? They asked for a letter from the city in their application.
Yes, we encourage applicants to use that notification that we send to applicants, letting them know that the record status has been updated to local compliance underway as their evidence to the state that local compliance is underway.
Okay, this one is from Fred. Can we apply for different licenses for the same location? For example, retail and lab testing.
I'm sorry, can you repeat that question again, Dr. Brown?
Yes. Can we apply for different licenses for the same location? For example, a retail and a lab testing license for the same location.
Yeah, so you can use the same location for multiple activities, but as Assistant Executive Director Jason Colleen mentioned, you will have to have a premises diagram that shows how those particular activities are separated at the particular location, either by walls or other structures. But I do want to use this as an opportunity to articulate a requirement that exists both at the state and local level. Individuals who own testing, who are owners of testing licenses, are not allowed to own any other license type. And so if you choose to participate in testing activity, you are essentially choosing to not participate in any other activity. There's part of the reason for that is to make sure that we are making sure that maintaining the integrity of the testing process. And so I just wanted to relay, while you can combine activities, we should not be seeing similar ownership of a retail license in a testing lab. That is prohibited both at the state and local level.
Hey, thank you. This is from Philip. Will the DCR be supplying an actual license that must be displayed in the place of the business?
Yes, we will be providing a physical license that must be displayed. We're in a process right now of updating those templates. Anticipate folks who have temporary approval will receive those updated documents no later than the start of the new year. In the interim, folks should be utilizing the notification that they receive via email.
Okay, and this one is from Gwendolyn. What is included in a micro business license?
Pass that question to Jason.
At the local level, micro business is associated with the retail storefront commercial cannabis activity. It's different than the state level. So at the local level, you have to apply for each of the individual commercial cannabis licenses. So if you wanted to pursue a micro business license with the state, you could apply for micro business at the local level plus type 6 manufacturing and cultivation processing. And then that would be 3 activities that could be used to qualify for the Department of Cannabis Control's micro business license. Micro business at the local level must have the retail storefront component. However, at the state level, you're not required to have a retail storefront with on-site sales. So you can kind of mix and match local license types to get to a micro business option at the state level. We also have a delivery only micro business option. For that particular activity, it covers zones that wouldn't be included under the general type 9 license type.
Okay, we have a few more questions that we have time for. This one is from Lakaya. Where can I find a zoning map or the zoning map?
So, and I'll pass it to Jason in case he has some follow-up, but what we're providing to individuals in our information procedure bulletin is a chart that describes a summary of where particular activities can take place in certain zones. More detailed information in the requirements can be found in the municipal code, but I would direct folks first to the chart that is in the current information and procedure, the pre-application review information and procedure bulletin. Jason, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, so there's a couple different resources. One resource is on the department's website under the licensing tab. It's the licensing map. That has information as it relates to all of the retail storefront locations that have temporary approval to engage. It also allows the user to toggle on where we have pending applications. It has a list of the sensitive uses known from the last quarterly verification date that can be toggled on, as well as all of the disproportionately impacted areas under the revised code for social equity individual applicants. So you can see whether or not an address falls within one of those areas. Separate and apart from the licensing map, the Department of City Planning maintains the Zoning Information Map Access System, or ZEMAS. You can find more detailed information about parcels and being able to use different measuring tools and the actual zoning for a given parcel via the ZEMAS online portal.
Okay. So with that, we are really running over time. I want to thank Kat and Jason and thank all of you for attending this informative webinar offered by the Department of Cannabis Regulation, our Business Licensing and Compliance Assistance Program. Before signing off tonight, folks, please don't forget to fill out the survey about your thoughts on tonight's webinar. The link for this survey is dropped in the Zoom chat box. We'll also receive an email with the link to the survey following tonight's event. DCR will also be providing an additional licensing webinar, as Kat mentioned earlier, that takes place on October 26th from 6 to 7:30 p.m. You can register for that webinar as well as other webinars in our October webinar series at cannabis.lacity.org. So with that, have a wonderful rest of your evening, and we will see you soon. Thank you so much, everybody.